Welcome to This Explainer. Right out of the gate today, we are unpacking something incredibly complex and, frankly, highly controversial that's been making some serious waves online. We're going to take a totally clinical, documentarian-style look at a specific speaker's claims about a so-called modern ideological alliance. To be clear, we are absolutely not here to take sides. We're just strictly looking at the source material to map out exactly how this speaker builds his argument, taking it all the way from his historical critiques right down to today's internet drama. Let's figure out the mechanics of this worldview together. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to hit the core alliance theory, how he targets internet personalities, his critique of political figures, the claims around harassment and theological views, and finally, his ultimate call to action. Let's jump right in. Section 1, the core alliance theory. This is basically ground zero for his whole argument. So, what exactly is this Islamo-communist alliance? Well, according to the source, the speaker uses this specific phrase as the ultimate lens for viewing modern culture and politics. In his mind, this isn't just some fringe internet movement. He defines it as a unified, ideological force that he claims is actively engaged in conquering Western nations. And honestly, you have to understand this definition because it completely colors his interpretation of literally everything else we're about to talk about. To lay the groundwork for this theory, the speaker adopts what he calls a documentarian perspective. Essentially, he uses this framing to launch some incredibly heavy, sarcastic critiques at Islamic history and culture. For instance, he openly mocks Islam's holiest figure regarding a historical child marriage, sarcastically suggesting the figure deserves credit for waiting until she was 9. He also takes aim at alleged modern cultural demands, claiming there's a push to lower the voting age to 13th specifically so young wives can vote. He's presenting all of this to argue that there's a fundamental cultural incompatibility happening here. Moving on to Section 2, targeting internet personalities. Because he doesn't just leave this theory in the history books. He applies this exact framework straight to the digital influencers shaping modern culture. He specifically singles out 3 main figures as prime examples of this cultural clash: a popular Twitter account he calls Junior, a commentator he dubs Fogrogan, and a content creator named Sneeko. Let's break down exactly how he dissects these 3. Okay, so let's look at the timeline he lays out for Junior. The speaker claims it started with Junior allegedly making anti-Semitic comments, which led to him getting demonetized. Then it escalated during a Twitter space where Junior reacted violently to criticism, supposedly declaring anyone insulting Islam his enemy and threatening to cut off their heads before completely deactivating his account. Following this wild sequence, the speaker points to a theory that Junior was actually arrested down in Florida because of these threats. The speaker uses this whole saga to argue, in his view, that people exhibiting this kind of behavior will simply never assimilate into American culture. Then he pivots to a commentator he calls Fogrogan, and he uses absolutely relentless mockery here. This creator claimed she was assaulted by a group of Zionist men. The speaker's response? He argues she couldn't identify the attackers because they literally do not exist. He compares her story straight to the fabricated Jussie Smollett incident and sarcastically jokes that she was able to escape because she's notoriously incredibly swift. He even mocks communists for believing her, comparing it to an allegedly fake story about Ilhan Omar almost being assassinated with a glass of water. And then there's Sneeko. Sneeko is an influencer who converted to Islam, and after a trip to Mecca, he announced he'd received a prophecy to adopt an orphan. The speaker completely trashes this logic, dropping derogatory comments about Islamic history regarding adoption. But what's fascinating is how he ties this back to his own beliefs, specifically his opposition to homosexuals adopting children. He even suggests that deporting someone like Sneeko would be a moderate option, which, is a pretty extreme take considering Sneeko is an American citizen. Which brings us to Section 3, critiquing political figures. This is where things get really interesting, as the framework jumps from internet drama into formal, established politics. The speaker doesn't hold back here. He aggressively targets Michigan Senate candidate Abdul El-Sayed, claiming the candidate supports Hamas, which the speaker argues should instantly disqualify him from politics. When El-Sayed later overcorrected by publicly declaring his love for Judaism, the speaker mocked it, pointing out the dead silence it caused among El-Sayed's own base. And he drags Bernie Sanders into it too, mocking his anti-capitalist stance for flying a private jet just to support El-Sayed. He even pulls in international news, bringing up a Nigerian lawyer wearing a niqab, and uses it to basically call England a joke country that isn't a superpower anymore. But the ideological contrast really peaks when he goes after Linda Sarsour and the Democratic Socialists of America. The source notes that the speaker accuses Sarsour of essentially wanting to tear up the Declaration of Independence to create a completely borderless, totally inclusive America. To make his point, he sharply contrasts this vision with the rigid national identities of countries like Japan, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, framing her ideas as incredibly naive and dangerous. To really grasp the gravity of this in the speaker's mind, just look at the exact words he uses. He doesn't view Sarsour's push for marginalized leadership as just normal democratic participation. No, he frames it as a literal attempt to topple America the Great Satan. This isn't just a political disagreement for him, it's an existential battle for the nation's survival. Section 4. Harassment and Theological Views. Now, things get incredibly serious here as we look at real-world threats. The speaker heavily focuses on a Christian YouTuber known as Inspiring Philosophy, or IP. He meticulously lays out how IP's online theological debates with Muslims spiraled into terrifying real-world consequences. We're talking severe doxing, intense death threats, to the point where IP actually had to flee his own home to protect his family. For the speaker, this highlights a massive, glaring irony. He's pointing out that these violent threats are coming from followers of a religion that is widely called a religion of peace. And we're not just talking about generic, angry internet comments here. The speaker emphasizes hyper-specific, terrifying threats, things like targeting the actual school where IP's sister works, and horrifying threats of sexual violence against his partner. The speaker is putting these specific details front and center to validate his core theory, that this ideology poses a literal danger to Western citizens. So how does the speaker think these perpetrators justify this? Well, he points straight to theology. The commentary states that there's a specific, radical definition of the word peace at play here. He argues that radicalized individuals define peace not as everyone getting along, but as a theological state where the entire world submits to Allah. By that logic, he argues they can morally justify violence against non-believers, because eliminating anyone who resists that submission technically brings the world closer to their twisted version of peace. Finally, Section 5, the call to action. Everything builds to this exact moment. It turns out this entire theory is deeply, deeply personal for the speaker. He reveals that he, along with other creators, has been explicitly targeted by Middle Eastern terrorist organizations. The source explains that the FBI literally showed up at his front door to warn him about a plot against his life. In response to this insane reality, he pushes IP's relocation GoFundMe and loudly questions why communists and Muslims seem to be aligning against Western figures. And that brings us to his ultimate demand. In response to these FBI warnings, he calls for the immediate removal of these groups from Western civilization. He labels this a mostly peaceful crusade. Obviously, that is an incredibly loaded, intense phrase, but it perfectly sums up just how polarizing and escalated his worldview has become. Which leaves us with this massive question. We've just mapped out a perspective that literally connects Twitter beefs to Senate races, all the way to ancient theology and FBI warnings. If a worldview so seamlessly blends internet drama, geopolitical tension, and religious theology, how does studying it impartially help us understand the root mechanics of modern political polarization? By breaking down the structure of these arguments without getting sucked into the emotional vortex, we can actually equip ourselves to better understand the intense forces shaping our world right now. Thank you so much for joining this explainer. Keep asking questions, and we'll see you next time.